In order to follow the project in the next section, and also the other projects in this course, it's going to be very helpful to be familiar with the basics of HTML and CSS. And so that's what this section is all about. It's a very simple crash course in HTML and CSS just to get you started with these technologies. Now, if you already know HTML and CSS, then please just skip this section. But if not, then let's now move on. So before we start this basic HTML and CSS crash course, let me tell you again that you should only take this if you have no knowledge about HTML and CSS at all. So if you do, then just move on to the next section. But for the rest of us, let's now get started and learn a little bit about HTML structure and elements. And let's start by creating a new project folder here on the desktop, which I'm just going to call HTML CSS. And in this section, we're actually not even going to have any starter files. So we're just going to create everything from scratch. Okay, so let's go back to VS Code and open this newly created folder. And here we go. So let's open up, or actually let's create an index.html file. And index.html is always the name of the main file in any project. Okay, let's hide this sidebar here. And I'm going to use Command B for that, or Control B on Windows. All right, so HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And we use it to describe the content of web pages, basically. And an HTML document is made out of elements, and we write elements using an opening and a closing tag. The main element in all HTML documents is always the HTML element. So we write HTML, and then VS Code automatically gives us the closing tag. So you see the closing tag has just the same name as the opening tag, but then it has this slash here to close it. Okay, so every HTML document always has to start with the HTML opening tag and then close with the HTML closing tag. Then inside the HTML element, we always have the head and the body. So let's write that. Head and body. So this is always the structure that we use in HTML. Now, whatever we put into this head here is basically like the settings of the page. So it's like describing the page. For example, with the title. So for that, we use the title element. And let's call this one Learning HTML and CSS. And then once again, VS Code automatically gives us the closing tag here. So this title here is what's going to be visible in Google Chrome. So basically this title of the page right here. Okay, and you will see that in a second. Other things that we put here in this head, which is again like the settings of the page, is CSS styles or fav icons. So that little icon that appears here in browser tabs and stuff like that. Then whatever we put into the body is what's actually going to be visible on the page. And let's start by adding a heading here. And for that, we use the H1 element. And this is a level 1 heading. Okay, so you have H1, H2, all the way to H6. And they will have different styles automatically applied by the browser. Anyway, let's now give it here a title. And let's say, JavaScript is fun, but so is HTML and CSS. So just like before, we put the actual content here between two tags. So the opening tag, which is H1, and then the closing tag, which is this slash H1 to close the element. And different types of elements have different purposes. For example, H1 is to describe a heading, but we have other ones. For example, we have the P element to describe a paragraph. So let me show that as well. So let's write a little bit longer text here. So you can learn JavaScript without HTML and CSS, but for DOM manipulation, it's useful to have some basic ideas of HTML and CSS. And of course, the text here doesn't really matter. It's just so that we have some content on the actual page. And speaking of the page, let's now actually preview it here in Google Chrome. And for that, let's use the live server tool that we installed in the previous section. So for that, I'm going to use the integrated terminal by hitting Control/. Okay, so again, this very weird shortcut, or I can also do it from the menu. So that's going to be new terminal down here. Okay, then I can clear the terminal from all this weird stuff with Command or Control-K. And so now it's a bit cleaner. Again, it's not important at this point that you really understand everything about the terminal. We will learn really a lot about it kind of by the end of the course. For now, all we want to do is to use the live server, just like we did in the previous section. So when we hit enter on this, this should now open up the page in this Chrome window here. And indeed, here we go. And you can already see that the browser applied some basic formatting based on the type of element. So this H1 here is way bigger and bolder than the main text down here, which is this paragraph, right? And let's add another paragraph here so we can see it appear on the page as well. So P again, just another paragraph. So when I save this now, the result should automatically appear here on the right side. And here we go. And again, as I told you in the previous section, if this live server is not working for you, then that's no problem at all. You can always just open the HTML document itself. Anyway, let's take a look at another heading here. So as I was saying, there is not just H1, but also other type of headings. So let's simply put one here. So let's say an H2, another heading. And so as you see, this one here is a bit smaller than this one. And if I would change it to an H6, and you see automatically it changed the 6 here, and that's because of an extension that I have. I'm not sure if I showed it to you in the last section. So that extension is called the auto rename tag. And the one that automatically closes a tag that I open is this auto close tag extension up here. So these two extensions that I have here, they are very useful for writing HTML. Okay. And here you already saw this reloading. And so you see that H6 is actually even smaller than the paragraph text. Okay. So you see that these elements, which are composed of an opening and a closing tag, are really used to describe content in this way. Now, of course, we can do a lot more than just headings and paragraphs. For example, links or images. But for that, we need to learn about attributes. And we're going to do that in the next video. Now, just to finish this lecture, I wanted to show you that we can actually create this bare bones structure of HTML in a very easy way in VS Code. All we have to do is basically type exclamation mark and then tab, and like magic, all of this appears. So we still have the HTML tag, and then in there we have the head and the body just like we had before. The difference is that we also got this doc type here, which essentially identifies this document as being HTML5, and we also get this language here on HTML. So in this case, it's telling the browser that we're using the English language. Here is some other stuff that's also important, but that I'm not going to go into now. And then here is the title that we just specified also in our document up here. So now I will just go ahead and take this content and put it here in this structure because it's actually more complete. So just take this and cut it, put that here, delete all of this, give it a save, and let's put this one here back to H2. And here we go. Actually, we can close this one. And all right. So see you in the next lecture, where we're going to talk a little bit about attributes and classes and IDs. Let's now learn about HTML attributes, classes, and IDs, and then also learn about a couple more different HTML elements. So what are attributes? Well, in HTML, some elements can have attributes, and these attributes basically describe elements. So let's, for example, create a link, and this link will be inside of this paragraph. Okay, so as you already saw, we can nest elements inside one another. For example, this h1 is inside the body, and this p element is also inside the body. So they are child elements of the body element. Okay, so I forgot to mention that in the last lecture. Anyway, so let's now add this link element inside of the paragraph. And for that, we use the anchor element. So it's an A. And then in here, we put a text that we want to be displayed on the page. So just like before in the paragraph, for example. So here I want to place a link to my profile on Udemy. So let's say Jonas on Udemy. But now, how do we tell the browser where this link should actually point to? And that's where the attributes come in. So as I said, we use attributes to describe elements. And in this case, we describe this anchor element using the href attribute. And so href stands for hypertext reference. And so here we put the URL where this link should point to. Okay, and so let's actually get my profile page on Udemy. So Jonas, Udemy, and that's actually the link, I think. Yes. So let's copy this and put it here. Okay, give it a save. And now, well, here we have to reload it. So sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes we have to reload. Okay, so when you don't see it changing right away, just reload and then it will work. So here we have this now blue link. And so that's the standard format of any HTML link. And when we now click this, indeed, it goes to my user page here on Udemy. And of course, you can use your own link or whatever link you want to use. Okay, and then we can go back and we're back on this page. Okay, so that's what we used this href attribute for. We described the anchor element by telling it which URL it should go to whenever we click on the link. Now here on the page, you can actually see that this text here, so this link, is right in line with the previous text, so the text here in this paragraph. That's why we call the anchor element an inline element. Okay, so it flows in line with the rest of the text. Now on the other hand, for example, this h2 element here is a so-called block element. Because as we see here, this heading is not in line with the text of the previous element. It created a new line which only contains this content of this heading, right? So all of this here is this huge block, and so it's a block element, not an inline element. Okay, so we can actually include this link here in a sentence. So let's say you can learn more about it, and then let's say on Udemy. Here we need a space. Okay, and so now this looks like a normal sentence, and then with a link in it. And we can even put a period after it. Great, so let's check out another element which needs attributes, which is the image element. So let's do that after this. Some more space here. And for the image, we use the img tag, and then the source attribute. And then in here, we can specify any image from the current working folder, or we can also set an image URL. So let's do that. So what I'm doing here is, since we're talking about HTML and CSS on this page, I want to copy this, this image here. Okay, so the image address. So I'm getting the image address here, and now I'm pasting it here. And so this JPEG image is now the source of this image. Okay, And now you see here that with the autosave, it added this closing slash. And that's because the image element does not have a closing tag. It only has an opening tag, which is img, of course, but then we don't have a closing tag. And so we can close this opening tab by the end using this slash here at the end of the tag. But it's actually not mandatory. It works just the same without this one here. Okay? So image doesn't have a closing tag because we don't really put any like written content in here. It's not like we say now course image or something and then close the image, right? That would make no sense. And so that's why images don't need the closing tag. Now, if we check it, indeed here now is the image. Okay, so that's the source attribute. And as you see, different elements have different attributes. So for example, the href attribute is not going to do anything on an image. And the opposite is true for the source attribute. So if we use source here on the anchor element, it's not going to have any effect. And so when you really learn HTML properly, you will then learn exactly which attributes you can use on which elements. But it's actually pretty straightforward and you get used to it pretty quick. Now, there are two very important attributes that we can actually use on all elements and which we can use to identify them. And these are classes and IDs. So we use classes and IDs to essentially name elements so that we can then select them in CSS in order to style them. And actually, we also use IDs and classes to select elements from JavaScript when we do DOM manipulation. So classes and IDs are crucial to identifying elements, and especially classes. And here's how that works. And again, we can add them on any element. So let's add one here to this paragraph. So all we have to do is class, and let's call this one the first. Okay, because it's the first of these two paragraphs. And then here, class. Again, and you guessed it, this one is going to be called second. And we're going to use these in the next lecture to then select the two paragraphs and style them differently. So then according to these classes. Now, as I said, beside classes, we also have IDs. And they work like this. So let's add it here to the image. Let's call it course image, just like this. Now, the difference between classes and IDs is that IDs have to be unique. Okay, so each ID can only be used once on the page, while classes can be used over and over again. So I could have more paragraphs called second, but I could not have another element called course image. All right. In practice, we actually almost never use IDs to style elements or to select them from JavaScript. It's just a better practice to use classes. Okay, and now to finish, let's create an HTML form so that we can use some more attributes. Okay, so let's do that here after the image. And now I will also introduce you to the idea of basically creating boxes. So we want the contents of this form to be in a box. And so there are many ways of creating boxes in HTML. The most generic box is a div. So let's say div, and let's give it a name here using an ID again, just that so we use classes and IDs in different places so that you can learn how to use both. So I'm calling this box here your name because that's what we're going to do in this form. So just an input asking for the user's name, basically. Okay, and here it already closed the element for me. Oh, and maybe you're also noticing that for the names here, so the ID name, but also for class names, in CSS we use the dash to separate two different words. So in JavaScript we would use camel case, so course, and then like this, right? But the convention in CSS is to write it like this. Of course, it would also work the other way, but this is just a convention. Okay, and let's create just a heading for this form, your name here. Okay, and you can see that, of course, we can have multiple H2 elements here on the same page. So we have here a secondary heading and here another one. Okay, so we already have the H2 here now, And there's also this box around it, but you cannot really see it. But we will see it in the next lecture when we actually style all of these elements using CSS. Anyway, let's now add another paragraph here. Please fill in this form. And now let's actually use an input element. And so with that, we are then basically creating a form. So input, and then we use the type attribute to specify the type of data that should be inputted into this element. So once again, we're using an attribute to describe this element. So here we could use text, or as you can see here, we could use button, checkbox, email, file, and so on and so forth. But here we're just going to use text. And then we can even specify a placeholder. Now we'll just use the autocomplete functionality here. Okay. And we close it. And once more, this is one of the elements which does not have a closing tag. Because, well, again, it doesn't make much sense to have that here. And then usually a form also has a button. And so for that, we have the button element. And in this case, it actually makes sense to have content. And so that's why there is a closing tag, which VS Code automatically placed there for us. Let's give it a save. And here we go. Nice. So we have a nice input and a button. Now, of course, nothing will happen because for that, we would need some JavaScript. But that's not the point of this lecture or of this section. But now you know how to create a form like this. And now just to finish this form, we should actually change the name or the type of the element of this box here. Okay? Because this is now a form because it has this input and this button elements. And so in HTML, we have a special element for that, which is instead of div, we use form. Okay? Give it a save and it looks exactly the same, but this is more semantic. What this means is that the form element better describes the content that is inside of the box than just the generic box that is the div. Okay? So the div element is really just a generic box which has no meaning at all. And so that's usually not a good idea for many reasons. For example, for SEO. When Google searches your page, it's better if it knows exactly what each element means than just having generic boxes without any meaning at all. Okay? So using the appropriate element according to the content that's in it is the idea of semantic HTML. In this case, we are creating a form here because we have an input and a button, and so we use the form element that HTML gives us just for this purpose. Okay? It looks exactly the same as a div element, but it has meaning, and so it's semantic. Okay, and that's it for this video. In the next one, we're finally gonna style all this using some HTML. Let's now learn about the very basics of CSS and make our web page look a little bit nicer. So as you probably already know, we use CSS to style elements and to create a layout for the overall page. And we can write CSS right here in the HTML file using the style element. Okay, and that style element is not for visible content here on the page, and so it should go right here into the head. Okay, because remember, the head is basically like for settings of the page. And the style definitely counts as a setting. So style. And now to style elements, we need to first select them. And there are different types of selectors in CSS, and we're going to learn about a couple of them in this video and the next one. But the most basic one is the element selector. And with the element selector, we can simply select all elements of a certain type. For example, the body. So we write body and then curly braces. And then in here, we can write our CSS declarations. So each CSS declaration has a property name and then a value. For example, we can style the background color. So background color, and let me actually autocomplete it here. So background color is the property, and then let's say green. So in CSS, there are a couple of predefined color names, and we can then use these. Give it a save, and bam, our page is green now. So that's CSS for you. So we have the body element selector. Then all of this here is our declaration block. And this here is a simple declaration where background color is the property and green is the specified value. Now, usually we write our CSS in an external CSS file. So just like we write JavaScript in an external script, we do the same basically with CSS. So let's create that separate CSS file. So I'm bringing back the sidebar here using Command or Control B. And then let's call this one the style.css. Close the sidebar. And now we need to connect these two. So again, just like we had to connect the JavaScript file to the HTML, we also have to select the CSS. But it works a bit differently. So let's get, or actually let's copy this here, or cut it here. So when I save it now, of course, it's gone, okay? And that's because the style file is not yet linked to the HTML. So we link it by using the link element. So that's not very creative. So here we use href again, which remember is the same attribute as in the anchor element here. Okay, but don't confuse anchor with link. So link does not create a clickable link, so like this. Instead, we use it only to basically link CSS files to HTML files. So here we say style.css because that's the name that we gave to the file. Okay, and then we also need to specify the rel attribute and set it to style sheet. Give it a save, and here we go. The green color is back. Okay, and so now we can write all our styles in the separate file here, and so we separated the presentation from the content. So let's actually make this like yellow, and we should probably give it a little bit a nicer color. And in VS Code, when you hover a color like this, you see this pop-up, which then allows you to select the color. And this is very handy. So let's do this, and then maybe just a very subtle color like this. All right, this looks a lot better already. Okay, so let's now explore some more CSS properties. For example, we can set the font family. And here we can start by setting it to a font that you probably have on your computer. And so Arial is probably one that you have. Now in practice, we use web fonts, for example, from a service like Google Fonts. Okay, but in this case, it doesn't really matter. So let's just give it a save. And so you now saw this font here changing. And on your system, that should work too. And if you don't have Arial, then just use some other fonts that you have available. But now you might ask, we set the font family on the body, right? So why did all these elements, like this H1 here and this P element and this H2 element, why did all of them get the Arial font as well? Well, that's because the font family property is a property that gets inherited, okay? So all the child elements of the body element will automatically get this font family assigned to them. And that makes it very handy so that we don't have to go ahead and set the font family separately on all these elements. So just setting this on the body will then set it on all the child elements. Now, most properties do actually not inherit, but generally all the properties that are related to fonts will inherit. So let's check out another one. Font size, and let's set it to 20 pixels. Give it a save, and you see that everything got a little bit bigger now. However, not all the elements have a font size of 20 pixels now. And that's because the elements like this H1 and this H2 have predefined font sizes that automatically are applied from the browser if we do not specify them on our own. Okay? But of course, we can override them with our own selectors. So let's say h1, and so this is another element selector, and in this case, of course, it selects the h1 element. So let's say font size 50 pixels. And so take a look at this now, and well, that's huge. Let's make it a little bit smaller, maybe 40. Yeah, that looks about right. All right, and now let's actually use the class names and the IDs that we set in the previous lecture to now select elements based on these classes. So remember that here we set this paragraph to first and this one to second. So we basically named them like this. And in fact, let's go ahead and add another class here to this other paragraph. So class, and I will call this one first 2. Okay, so remember, IDs have to be unique, so we can only use them once, but classes can be used multiple times. And so that's what we did here. And so now I can go ahead and select all the elements which have the first class, so this paragraph, and then style them however I want. And this will then only affect these 2 paragraphs, but not this one. Okay, because this one has the second class. So let me show that to you. And so the class selector is using the dot. So dot first. Okay, and so this is our selector. Dot is for the class, and then first is the class name. And so we set the text color using the color property. And let's set it to red, give it a save, and what do you think will happen now? That's right. This paragraph and this one, which are the 2 paragraphs which have the first class, are now red. But this other paragraph is of course not red because we didn't select it here. Okay, and so this CSS rule here does not apply to it. Finally, let's also format or form. So let's check that out. And so here we have this your name ID, right? So we already know how to select based on the class name. And so let's now learn how to select based on ID. And it's very similar, but instead of the dot, we use the hash. So hash your name, I think that was the ID, right? Yes, your name. So let's set a different background color here. And I will again use this trick where I can now set the color using this pop-up window. So that's a trick I like to use. Let's make it similar, but a little bit darker. Yes, that looks nice. And we will make it even nicer in the next lecture after we learn about the box model. But for now, this looks good already. So another one that we can use here is the border property. And the border property is a so-called shorthand property, because here we can set multiple values for just one property. So for the border, we can set the width, so basically the thickness of the border. So let's say 5 pixels. Then we can set the style of the border, and let's make it solid, but we could also make it dotted or dashed, but that would look a little bit like weird. And then the color. So until now, we have always used CSS color names or this RGB format like this. But of course, CSS also accepts RGB colors. So for that, we use the hash, and then let's use 444 as this dark gray. So you see this is a dark gray, but we could of course change it again using this pop-up. Okay, but let's leave it here with the RGB code, give it a save, and here you see this nice border around the form. Okay, so again, this border is a shorthand property because it allows us to specify multiple values here like this. You can also notice that this property is not inherited, right? So unlike the font family or the font size, because if it was inherited, then now all these child elements here would have a 5 pixel border around them as well, right? So this one and this one, but they do not. And well, in this case, it wouldn't make sense. And so that's why border is not inherited. Okay, and this should be enough for one lecture. In the next one, we will learn about the box model so that we can then add some spacing here. For example, some spacing here inside of this box to give it some space here and also some space between these elements. So stay tuned for that and see you in the next lecture. The box model is one of the most fundamental parts of CSS. That's because it's the main factor that defines how elements are displayed on a web page and also how they are sized. So according to the box model, each and every element on a web page can be seen as a rectangular box. And each box can have a width, a height, padding, margins, and a border. And we can specify all these using CSS properties. But note that they are all optional. So there can be boxes with no margins or no paddings or no border at all. Now this image here shows us how the box model works. And so let's break it down. First, the content of a box is where all the text, images, and other content that we specify goes. We can easily define its height and width using the corresponding CSS properties. Next, the padding is a transparent area around the content, but still inside of the box. And we use paddings to create white space inside of a box, and we can define the padding by specifying the padding property in CSS. Next, we can specify a border for any box, and that border then goes around the padding and the content. And this actually we already did in the last lecture, right? Then, similar to the padding, we have the margin. But instead of being inside the box, the margin is white space that's actually outside of the box itself. So we can think of margin as the space between boxes. So for instance, if we want to create some space between two elements, we will simply use their margin properties in CSS. And finally, there is something called the fill area. So remember how the text content and images go inside the content box? Well, the same does not apply for background images or the background color of a box. These properties will actually be applied not only to the content box, but to the entire fill area, which also includes the padding and the border, but not the margin. Okay? All right, so let's go back to our code and implement some of these properties. Now, if we take a look at our page here, we will see that actually there's already a lot of space here, right? For example, between this heading and this paragraph, and here is space, and here, and there's also a lot of space around this H2 element here, and that's because by default, some elements get some margin automatically if we don't define them, okay? Now that can create some problems when we're trying to style our page, and so usually what we do is that we reset all of the margins and all of the paddings on all elements before doing anything else. So this is called a global reset. And so to do that, we need to select all the elements. And for that, we have a special selector. And that is the star selector. Okay, so again, with this, we can select all the elements on the page. So what we do then is to set the margin to 0 pixels. And when we use 0, we don't even need to specify the unit. So just 0 like this. And the same for padding set to 0 as well. If I give it a save now, it looks like this. So all the paddings and all the margins are effectively gone. And that's exactly what we wanted. Now we also need to add another property here. I mean, we do not have to, but we usually always do, which is the box sizing property set to border box. Okay, now this will not change anything here, and I'm not going to go into detail what this does. I'm just putting it here so that you know that we always use it. Okay, so essentially what this does is that it will include paddings and borders into the width or the height that we specify for an element. So for example, if we specify the width of an element to 100 pixels and then add a padding of 20 pixels on each side, then 100 plus 20 would be a total width of 140 pixels, which could create problems if all we wanted was a width of 100 pixels. And so to fix this, we use box sizing set to border box. And so in this case, if we specify the width to 100 pixels, it will always be 100 pixels no matter how much the padding. Okay? And if that doesn't make a lot of sense to you at this point, then you can always Google around how it works if you want to go into more detail. But since this is just a crash course, I'm not going to go into a lot more detail. So now what I want to do is to add back some margins and some paddings so that you can see how exactly they work. And let's actually add with the body, and here we will set some padding. Okay, and why do we use padding? Well, it's because we want to add some space inside of this body element. So basically to create some space between the border of the browser, so of this viewport, and the content. So let's set it to 75 pixels. And by the way, there are also other units in CSS. We don't always have to use pixels. We can use percentages or other more weird units like M or rem or points or anything like that. But to start out, it's easier to just understand with pixels. Okay, so give it a save. And so now you see that it added this nice space between the sides. Okay, it's maybe a bit too much. Let's put it back to like 50. Okay, and now let's move on and add some space between this heading here and this paragraph. And to do that, we can simply add some margin to the bottom of this H1. Okay, so we can specify paddings and margins like this. So as we did here, margin and padding, and that will then apply them to the four sides of the element. But we can also do that selectively to only the left side or the right side or the top side or the bottom side. And so let's now add margin to the bottom of H1. So margin and then bottom. And let's say 25 pixels, give it a save, and here we have, okay? Now, if we did padding here, it would actually look the exact same way. Let me show that to you. And indeed, it works the same way. But now this space is inside of the H1. Let me show that to you using the inspector. So this is the H1 and the green part is the padding. You can also see that here. So this is the content and then we have 25 of padding. Then here you also have the border and then the margin outside of the border, so outside of the element. And essentially this is what we learned at the beginning of this video, right? But it makes more sense for this space actually to be outside of the element. And so a margin in this case makes more sense. And so you see that now this 25 is here painted in red, right? And so it's now outside of the element. Okay, so this element tab here in the developer tools is pretty useful to inspect so the styles of all the elements and also to check out the markup, so the HTML in here. We can turn on and off these different properties, and in general this is really helpful to work with HTML and CSS in the browser. Next up, we should probably also add some spacing after the H2 elements. So let's say margin bottom 20 pixels. Okay, and we can also do another thing that I didn't show you before, which is to set the text align property. So text align, and now we can set it to left, right, or center. And I want to set it to center here. And then, as you expect, the text will get centered here. So basically centered inside this whole box. So the H2 box, and again, we can see the box using the inspector. Okay, so the box itself is this whole blue space that we can see up there. And so the text of the H2 is then centered inside the H2 box. Okay, and remember that this is a block element. And so that's why it creates a box basically. So block elements are the elements that create their own line, and inline elements, remember, is like the link here. So if we inspect this one, you see that the box only occupies the space of the text itself, right? It doesn't create a whole box on a whole line. So that's the big difference between inline and block elements. All right. Okay. So this form here, of course, is also a block element. And so let's make it a little bit more narrow. And so as we learned by the beginning of the lecture, we can do that using the width property. So let's set it to 400 pixels. And that looks a lot nicer. Okay. Now we also want to create some space between all this content and the border. And so how do we do that? Well, that's right. We have to use padding, because padding creates space inside of the box. And yes, indeed it does. And now let's also create some space between the image and this form here. Okay. And so here we can add some margin to the top. So margin top, and let's say, well, 50 pixels. Might be a bit too much. Yeah, let's just set it to 30 so we can see it. And now let me actually just show you what happens if we take out this property here. Okay, so we can comment it out just like we comment out code in JavaScript. So let's hit command slash. And so you see in CSS, the commands are like this. So slash star star slash and not slash slash. Okay. And so as I save now, take a close look here at this form. And you see that it now get wider. So let's inspect it here. So the form, we need to select the form here and then scroll down. And so now you see what I explained earlier. So we defined the width as 400, but then we have a padding of 25 here, right? And so that then gets added to the total width of the element. So we have 400 plus 25 here plus 25 here, and then also 5 pixels border on each side. So 5 here and 5 here. And so that makes it then that the whole element adds up to 460 pixels, I would guess. So you can see that here on the screen, so up here, that it says that the width is actually 460, okay? And so again, that's because it adds up all the borders and the paddings to the width. And that's what happens without box sizing to border box. But if I put it back on, so again, command slash, if I save it now we are back to what we expected. So 400. So we set it here to 400, and so we wanted it to be exactly 400, and not for all the other stuff to be added. And so now, as you see here, it says 400. And so automatically CSS then changed the width of the content here to just 340 to accommodate the rest of the width, basically, that's needed for the padding and the border. Okay, so I said I wouldn't go into a lot of detail, but I guess I just did anyway. But anyway, let's now also add some margin to these paragraphs here. So I used the first class to select this paragraph and this paragraph. But now we want to select all 3 paragraphs. And so for that, we can simply use the P selector. And that will then select all of them regardless of any class names. Okay, so margin bottom, and let's set it to 10 pixels or 20 so we can see it a little bit better. And so you see that in fact, the margin now got applied to all 3 of these paragraphs just as we wanted. Next up, we can also select the input and the button. So here we have the input and the button elements, and we can also style them a little bit too. So let me actually show you another cool thing. So we have the input selector, but now we want these rules that we're going to write here to apply to both the input and the button. And so we can write input, comma, button. And so this rule here will then apply to both of these selectors. So let's add a padding of 10 pixels and increase the font size, let's say to 16 pixel. So look at them now. And indeed, they got bigger and they got this nice padding in there now. And once more, you can see that these two elements, so input and button, are inline elements. So this one and this one, they both don't create a box that occupies the whole line. So again, just like the link. And I can actually show that to you by styling just this link. So let's say a background color and set it to yellow. And then here you see, and at least I hope you can see it. Well, let's actually set it to yellow-green. I think that's another. Yes. And so now you can see it. And so the box now is only this element itself, but not the whole width of the screen. Okay. So actually, let's leave it like this so you can have this as a reference. And now to finish, I just want to show you one final but very important selector. And this one is actually pretty important for you to know because we're also going to use this all the time in JavaScript to select elements when we do DOM manipulation. Because in fact, all these selectors, the way they work in CSS, for example, the dot first, or here the ID selector, they're going to work just the same to select elements in JavaScript. And so that's one of the reasons why it's very important to learn how these selectors work. So anyway, the selector then I wanted to show you is the child selector. So the example I have here is that we have these two H2 headings. So this one and this one. But let's say I only wanted to select the H2 elements that are inside of this form here. Okay, so of course I could go ahead and add an ID or a class to this one. So here I could add an ID or a class, but I could also tell CSS to simply select this H1 that is inside of the element with the ID of your name. And so this is how it works. So again, we use the ID, your name. So just what we have here, and then a simple space, and then another selector. So in this case, that's simply the H2 selector, but it could be any other selector. So this here could also be a class selector or another ID selector, all right? But in this case, I just want to select the H2. And so let's change the color of this one, and let's change it to, I think there's one called olive, or let's use this one, olive drab. And yeah, indeed. Now this one is green and this one is not, because this one is not inside the element with the ID of your name, right? And so this one here is very useful and we use it all the time in CSS. And so that's why I wanted to show you this one here as well. Finally, just to make this a little bit smaller, let's also change the size of the image, because that's also something very important. So if we do not specify any sizes on the image, it will simply be as large as it can, okay? Or as large as the source image really is. But usually we don't want that. So on the image, it's pretty common to always set either a height or a width attribute. So let's do that here. So this one doesn't have, or maybe it does have a class. So, oh, actually it has an ID, okay? So we can, of course, use the image selector like I was just writing, but we can also use the ID. So the difference is that with the ID, if we had multiple images, then we would only select this one. So let's actually copy this one and use this. So ID, and then the name of the ID. And let's set the width here to 200 pixels. So what do you think will happen then to the height? Well, it's scaled proportionally. Okay, so that's very nice. Let's make it a bit bigger, 300 pixels. And so we don't have to worry about the height. We can still set it, but with that we will then change the aspect ratio. So if we set the height to also 300 pixels, it should then become a square. Yeah, that's right. Okay, and if we now turn off the width, so let's comment it out, then it will again scale proportionately. So the height is now 300, and then the width is calculated automatically. Let's set it back, and usually it's easier to simply specify the width. Okay, so that looks nice. Let's change the H1 a little bit to 35 to make it fit all in one line. And yeah, we have a nice little page here. It's not the best looking, but I think it taught you some things about HTML and CSS, at least the very fundamentals. So of course we only scratched the surface here, so probably this is less than like 5% of everything that there is to learn about CSS. So we didn't really talk about positioning, we didn't talk about Flexbox or CSS Grid, or many other important topics. But that wasn't also really the goal here. I just wanted to get you up to speed with the fundamentals of HTML and CSS so that you can understand a little bit of the code of the project that I included here in the course, and also so that you can learn how these selectors work, because as I mentioned, we will use them in JavaScript to select elements as well. So I hope you liked this small crash course, and I also hope I got you interested in HTML and CSS so that you now go ahead and research maybe a little bit more about it. Anyway, with that being said, let's now go straight into DOM manipulation in the next section, because that's really exciting and really cool.